we don't leave our colleagues too far in the dust. But just a reminder, guys, after we finish Chapter 6, we are going to do our second exam. And we are woefully behind where the aggressive schedule I put in the syllabus, but fear not, because we will cover the material we need to cover and we will cut where we need to cut. As you remember, too, for the remainder of the semester, the second test will be your last in-class test. The third test we do in this class will be an online test only. We'll cover material in class, but you'll take the test independently, open book, open notes. Good opportunity to be able to boost your test grade. And just a reminder that your next assignment is due on the 13th. I think I've covered this one pretty intensely, so I'm not going to cover that today, other than to remind you to get that done by the 13th. And again, I think I corrected that date. That's a Wednesday, isn't it? It's not a Monday. So, okay. Guys, we've talked a lot in this class about the idea that in the United States, if you are not in a right-to-work state, that you can be required to pay union dues. And I put that as a blanket statement, and I know that there are always exceptions to these rules, and this is one of the things I wanted to present to you guys today. There is an exception to this rule called the Janus decision, and it's celebrating its one-year anniversary this fall. Basically, there was debate about whether or not people who were members of public unions, that would be state and federal unions, or let me rephrase it, the members of state or federal employment could be compelled to join a union. The Janus decision basically came out and said there's an exception to the idea of a union shop when we are applying to public workers, people who work for the government. Basically, the logic behind this was that, in particular, unions, because they are doing state-level lobbying, could be considered as representing somebody's political beliefs. And so when this decision came from the Supreme Court, it was represented as a free speech issue, meaning if somebody is lobbying. So say, for example, I chose not to be a member of a labor union, but I'm still covered by a collective bargaining agreement, and I still pay dues. Well, the union, at some level, even if they're not specifically using my dues, the union itself is still speaking for me at a federal level or a state level by doing lobbying. In that case, they may be violating my right to free speech to be represented as I see fit. I'd like to show a little video for you that kind of details how this process came down and get you 2 cents about it. See what you think. See if you agree with the Supreme Court's decision or not. It also, by the way, shows the importance of political appointees when it comes to the Supreme Court as well. So we're going to start off with that video today before we get back into collective. The argument was, Mr. Janus essentially said, even though we can say that in a non-right-to-work state that the union is not allowed to use my money for anything other than collective bargaining and for grievance procedures, if you are dealing with the employer as a government, and the government is your employer, that the activity is implicitly political, meaning that collective bargaining and forcing somebody to pay for union dues specifically is a violation of somebody's free speech. And the Supreme Court sided on his side. So basically, for the last year, if you're a member of a public union, you cannot be forced to pay dues no matter where you work, no matter what state, no matter where you are in the country. That's the exception on the non-right-to-work state. What are your thoughts? There's a lot of sticky parts here, guys. What are your thoughts about this? Is this a free speech issue or not? I'm looking in particular at Jason and Ellie because I know you guys are thinking hard about this one. Any thoughts, guys? Or anybody for that matter. Yeah, Ellie, go ahead.
I feel like that makes in itself sense, because like when it discussed how Scalia passed away, that definitely did divide the court's idea. But when you do look at freedom of speech, freedom of, protest, freedom of organizing stuff such as that, I guess in a sense it makes sense by the way they took the terms collective bargaining and made it sound like it was political lobby in a sense. And I didn't think about that when it came to a public union, that you really are just going against the government whenever you try to collective bargain. But at the same time, I don't know if collective bargaining saying for better insurance, better wages is political, more so just humanitarian. I don't know.
And one of the arguments the court also made is that basically a government elicits more power over people who are employees of the government than the average citizen, too. Jason, what do you think? I'm just dying for your perspective on this.
Well, I mean, obviously commercial laws is pretty bad for unions just because it essentially means that their incomes aren't really guaranteed. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the legality of it, it's just there are these two very hazy areas of well, naturally you want to be able to bargain with your employer over terms, but if your employer is a government or a political entity, does that make it intrinsically political? I kind of agree with Elliot, where it's sort of the slippery slope of, well, everyone needs to bargain with their employers at some point to try and figure out your benefits and whatnot. But how does that really play in if it's a government entity? Because as you mentioned, if the government is employing you, well, then they have more influence than just being your government or just your employer.
Yeah, it's a compounded and more intense level of influence, I believe as well. Now, here's what else is interesting, though. When we look at the deeper politics of this issue, we go for the National Labor Relations Board judges themselves, the people who enforce labor law. Are they elected or are they political appointees? You remember? They're appointees. The current administration, for example, is a Republican administration. And my caveat again, I won't tell you which side is right or wrong. I'm characterizing these things based on party lines. So typically speaking, folks who favor conservative government typically are not pro-union. People who favor more liberal government are typically pro-union. One of his last acts as president, Barack Obama tried to get a Supreme Court judge approved who shared his views on labor. Did that judge get approved? No, it was held up. The Republican-controlled legislature essentially would not vote on it. And when Trump came to power, we ended up with a Supreme Court judge now who shares his pro-industry views. So in terms of this decision had come up in 2014 or 2015 versus today. Actually, if it had come up in 2015, it probably wouldn't have been made at all. It would have been a hung jury, not a hung jury, but basically an even split between the judges who were left standing. I don't know if we had gotten that other judge appointed if a different decision would have been made. But my point is that the bias of the particular folks in power can also have impact on how these kinds of decisions are made. That makes sense, guys? Okay. Guys, we're going to get back in a little bit on collective bargaining. And guys, one of the very first things when you're collectively bargaining, when the employer and the union are getting together to talk, we really want to start off with some level of cost assessment. So in other words, let's suppose you're the union. You're going to want to be able to go to your employer with some estimate of what you're really asking for. It makes sense to build a budget. What are we actually negotiating for? Can we actually look at what this stuff will cost? Can we have some understanding, for example, of what we're asking our employer for and if it's even financially possible? A good example of this would have been back in 2009 and the way the United Auto Workers worked with GM. You remember, what did the UAW agree to back in 2009 with General Motors? First off, what was happening in 2009 in the United States? Was it a good or bad economic time? It was bad. And so the union basically knew, hey, we're not in a powerful negotiating position. What was happening to GM at that point in time? Anybody remember? Go ahead, Elliot. Yeah, so when somebody's basically saying, look, we're going out of business, that's not the best time to ask for a raise. Like if Randy Fry has a department and says, hey, bad news, St. Francis is closing down, that's not the best time for me to say, yeah, Randy, I was going to talk to you about my cost of living adjustments this year and how we can get some better health care. So if you're the union, you have to also know what financial reality looks like. And so you're going to prepare your bargaining package and the things that you want to get money for based on what is out there. So, for example, employee background data. That might include things like knowing what people currently make, know what your health care costs. If you are giving everybody a raise, what impact is that going to have? And furthermore, let's think about it for a second. If you have a private company and you have a union, let's say, for example, the union wants higher wages. How can the company produce more money for higher wages? What are options that a for-profit company has? Yes?
Raise wages or cut costs somewhere else.
Yeah, you're going to have to find the money from somewhere else, or you could raise the price of your product, for example. Now, if you're in a public sector, for example, if the teachers want a raise, how do you raise money for that? It's a T word. Taxes. You're going to raise taxes. So anytime you want to, the old expression is you got to rob Peter to pay Paul. It means that there has to be some place to pull the money from. You either take the money from somewhere else, or you find a way to produce more money. Taxes are great if you can do them. It's also great, by the way, if you're in an industry that can bear some cost increases. Let me give you an example. Right now, in education, I think it's always good to be honest with people. By show of hands here, how many of you think the cost of college education is too high? I'm with you guys. It's expensive. And it was one of those things that a lot of the price increases we've seen in higher education have been as the universities have grown in size and scope. We've decided, not saying me personally, but we as an industry, have seen how far we can push the market. How high can we raise prices and not lose customers? We've seen it in the automobile industry too. What's the average price of a new vehicle in the United States? Too much. If you're buying a new F-Series pickup, be ready to pony up $60,000 and get ready for a 7-year term with a $700 a month car payment. That's not sustainable either. So, that being said, we've got two approaches, generally speaking, we can take to bargaining. We have what we call distributive bargaining and integrated bargaining. Here's how distributive bargaining might work. If Jared and I were involved in distributive bargaining, he's got 6 donuts, and I've got 6 cookies over here. I really like to have a couple of his donuts. And you like cookies? He'd like a couple of my cookies too. So it's going to be a matter of, what do I have to do to get one of his donuts? How many of my cookies do I have to give back? That's distributive bargaining. That's exactly how it works. You basically realize, how far can you push somebody to get what you want? Integrative is also referred to as win-win bargaining. That's a more collaborative type of approach, saying, how can we all win in this equation? So in distributed bargaining, for example, if I'm General Motors, I might say, can I push these guys to a starting wage of $55 an hour? That would be an example of distributed. Integrated might be, if I'm the United Auto Workers saying to GM, we know you want to make money, we know we want to make money. How can we work together? One is necessarily more kind of confrontational, one is more conversational. Guys, which do you think ultimately leads to more productive companies in the long run? We're talking about ideals here, but which do you think would be a more proactive, more sustainable approach? Yes? I would think so too. Although we do see a lot of distributed bargaining. And here's the trick. The same companies can take both approaches. If we go back to 2009, General Motors and the United Auto Workers were very much doing this because everybody wanted to survive. This last round of contract negotiations, how would you describe the relationship or the bargaining relationship between the United Auto Workers and General Motors? What do you think? Was it nice or was it confrontational? Yes.
Pretty not nice considering they went on strike, so probably like distributive.
I would completely agree with you. And that's the first time I think in 15 years General Motors has been on strike. So that says something. So in terms of strategies you can use to do bargaining, for example, you can try to persuade somebody with evidence. Guys, hey, look, here's the numbers. Since 2008, our people haven't had a raise in the United Auto Workers here at GM, but you guys have been making record profit. That's in the numbers. So we can paint a picture. For example, yes, General Motors, you guys were going bankrupt. Now you're doing great. We can also, for example, use what we call a bargaining caucus. And what that means, who here has ever heard the term caucus before? When you caucus with somebody, what does it mean? Here's an example. Like, as we're doing this class, if all of a sudden Emily and I had something we had to discuss, we'd be like, hey guys, keep talking. Emily and I are going to go over here and talk, and we're caucusing right now. We're breaking it into a smaller group. So you can have a bargaining caucus who only takes on one issue, for example. This group's going to take on benefits. This group's going to take on wages and salary. We're going to caucus and make it a smaller conversation. Why is it sometimes advantageous, guys, to have a smaller group conversation than a massive group conversation? What do you think, guys? I know there's a few of us today, but help me out. Don't even worry about the union. Why is it sometimes easier to talk with fewer people?
It's more confident. People who speak more.
Yeah, there's fewer opinions, there's fewer potential conflicts. I'm one of these people, guys, I don't know how you feel about this. I despise meetings. I despise them because I think very little gets done at meetings. I think a lot gets done in 2 to 4 person conversations. And if you get that done outside the meeting, that's where the real work happens. I think sometimes when too many people get together, you have too many, as the old expression is, too many cooks spoil the soup. And I think that's exactly what happens. We can also use what we refer to as positive reinforcement. That just simply means we're going to take a strategy where if the company says, you know what, we'll be willing to give you this. We'll be willing to give you this benefits package, and simply agreeing and saying, thank you, that would be really great. This would really work well. And sometimes also splitting the difference, meaning sometimes you realize that you're only going to get half what you're asking for. It's better than getting none of what you ask for. It all depends on the relationships you have. And in terms of distributive bargaining, for example, I'm not going to read all these to you, but distributive bargaining basically means that you can threaten to walk away from the table. You can do the old expression, it's tit for tat. What does that expression mean, by the way? When I say that's just tit for tat, what does that mean? Anybody have a sibling, by the way? How many siblings do you have? 4. Break out boys to girls.
3 boys, 2 girls.
3? Wow, okay. So have you ever had to get revenge on one of your siblings? Has anything really messed with you and you said, I can't wait to get them back? Has that ever happened?
Sometimes.
Oh, it happened with me and my brother all the time when we were kids. I have a twin brother, by the way. And my twin brother was 5'9" now he is. He's 5'9", he weighs about 160 pounds. You wouldn't even believe we were related. At one point when we were kids, I was a foot taller than him. And what he would do, because he was fast too, I'd be sitting somewhere, he'd come up behind me and slap me on the side of the head, and he would take off running and slide under a piece of furniture, and he'd wait me out for hours. Because I was bigger than him, I knew if I could punch him, I could hurt him really bad, but I had to wait him out. And so what I would do when he was least expecting it could even be days later, I'd slug him when I got the chance. And that was called tit for tat. It means you hit me, I hit you. And that is not a proactive type of bargaining approach in most senses. It can be effective, but it in the long run builds a more confrontational kind of approach. Other things that are bad to do too. You're basically threatening a company's well-being. If you're saying basically, hey GM, and I keep on using GM in the United Auto Workers because we talked about them so much. Hey GM, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to shut you down. We're going to stay here long enough that your company's going to start losing profits. Ultimately, that is tit for tat, and it's something that in the long run does not always produce good results. Conversely, if you're using win-win, mutual gain kind of bargaining, it just simply means you're trying to collaborate. Let's brainstorm. Let's see what the problems are. Let's talk openly about this. I would refer to this as a kind of marriage counseling, for example. You're sitting down with this person, or in this case, the other corporate entity, who is your partner in this endeavor, to say, what are we doing wrong and how can we improve it? Believe me, guys, in a relationship, when you get to the point where you're finger pointing and painting blame on somebody else, that relationship is not going to get better. It's going to get worse. And it's the same deal when it comes to companies. It's funny when you think about it. I talk about this in some of the 100-level business classes, but I absolutely think it's true. Guys, whenever you have a relationship of any kind, it's give and take. Whether it's a personal relationship, whether it's a business relationship, when you become too confrontational, when you become too much seeking revenge, when you become too much where you want to punish somebody else, the relationship loses its luster. If you're able to come to a conclusion where you both realize you want the same thing and you're willing to work toward it, that's when win-win bargaining works, whether it's a union environment or whether it's a personal relationship. It's really not that much different. Questions so far, guys? We have a quiet group here today, guys. Well, somebody tell me something. Share this with me. Can somebody share a time in their personal life, whether it was sports, whether it was school, whether it was an organization that you were part of, where you had to deal with conflict and you successfully Can you tell me a time when you successfully resolved the conflict? Yes.
I'll say this one, but it's kind of currently still in the process.
Okay.
So the D&D club, we recently had a huge argument over whether we want to introduce a new like game rule or not. And it was actually like super controversial, and it got to the point where I actually had to like post an announcement saying, "Hey everybody, calm down, we'll figure this out." So there's kind of a bit of bad blood between some folks in the club, and we're currently in the process of just kind of getting everyone back on the same page.
So what's your strategy for resolving the conflict? How do you think you're going to be able to do it?
Well, so we're hoping to have a meeting next week where we actually discuss the new rule, because the problem was it was kind of it was a rule some people wanted to introduce. It was very extreme and it was very out of nowhere, and a lot of people kind of pushed back because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing if we can't like find something in between.
Finding some common ground, perhaps?
That's the hope.
Yeah, I hope so too. Good example. Who else has ever dealt with conflict in their personal life, or in their sport, or at school? What have you dealt with? Yes.
Yeah, I guess it happens every day at soccer practice, and you requesting more people, and people talking back at you, and you talking back at them, and you almost want to kill them and their whole family. Sometimes you're like their brother, and like you have to hold yourself accountable, and like sometimes try to be the person that actually not just fight, but actually try to get something out of it. So, for example, if I have a discussion with someone in the field, not just like go after cursing, after just curse them and like not talk to them for a while, just actually go back there and talk about what are the issues and why that's happening between us.
So let cooler heads prevail. Yeah, sometimes getting away from the issue for a little bit too helps. And the expression I like to use is sometimes we love people that we don't always like. And so, for example, there are times we have a hard time dealing with people and we got to walk away from them. The other part of it, too, is I think, and this also applies to union bargaining, and it applies to personal life, is knowing when to let something go. What are the issues you need to fight about? What are the issues that you don't need to fight about? We're going to talk about things that are mandatory bargaining issues and things that are optional. In a relationship, guys, because all of you, at some point, well, not all of you, but a lot of you or most of you will probably end up in a marriage or a situation where you're living with someone. Believe me, you have this continuum of things you can fight about. There are things that are so little and minuscule that you're better off learning to let them go, and there are things that are a big deal. You have to learn to know where that stopping point is to let something go. I will tell you, however, the biggest fights you will ever have in your marriage, mark my words, when you come back as rich alums 15 years from now, the biggest fights you ever have in your marriage are going to be about the smallest things. I swear to God. It's going to be about who left the seat up. It's going to be over what you did or didn't say at a specific point in 2013. It's going to be about whether or not you remember to put something in the refrigerator. The biggest fights will be about the littlest things. The look on your face, Elliot, before I was a married man, I'd have made the same look on my face, but I'm wiser now. I know how this works. So trust me on this. All right. We'll get back in, though, guys. We're taking our time today because it's a mellow day and we have a small group. And I'm dispensing relationship advice, not even charging for it today. It's a therapy session you don't have to pay for. Guys, in terms of Chamberlain and Kuhn had a concept of bargaining power, and here's what that basically means. We have power equal to somebody else's ability to feel pain and to deal with the power we're exerting upon them. Here's what that means. If we have the United Auto Workers on this side of the table, and we have General Motors on this side of the table, the power that the United Auto Workers elicits basically is limited by how long General Motors could wait them out. Because General Motors had an inventory of vehicles, the United Auto Workers were producing those vehicles. So basically, at that point, the party's power to be able to equal the other party is based on how much financial pain and otherwise you can bear and wait out. For example, we had another instance a few years ago where the Hostess Bakery, Hostess, by the way, makes a confection that everybody loves. They're little, they're yellow, and they last forever. I'm talking about Twinkies. Yeah, Hostess made Twinkies. Well, Hostess had a collective bargaining agreement with a baker's union who was demanding higher wages. Hostess essentially said, if we pay you these wages, we're going to have to shut down. We cannot measure up to what you want. The union would not budge. As a result, Hostess went out of business. They ended up getting bought by another company. But basically, at that point, the party, essentially the union, went past the power they actually had and ended up causing the company to close. So again, both parties generally will use this power to the extent that they can, and they basically will be looking at what costs they can levy on the other party. Whoever has greater resources generally has greater power in this kind of concept. Some of the other things that affect this in terms of if we're a union or we're an employer, the unemployment rates are big. Guys, what's our unemployment rate in the United States right now? Anybody have a guess?
Isn't it like 3 or 4%?
Yeah, it's less than 4%. We're at sub 4% unemployment. That makes it whose market? Employees or employers?
Employees.
It's an employee's market right now. So employees are naming high prices. Oftentimes, low unemployment rates are not good for unions. Why is that, guys? Why does that make unions' bargaining power somewhat less? Help a brother out here. What do you think? Jared, why would that lessen the power of a union in a low unemployment rate kind of economic environment?
Well, if they had like a low unemployment rate, they would be able to replace people better.
Well, exactly right. And so if it's a low unemployment rate, we also have the belief that if I quit my job or if I lose my job, I can get another one. And I can also name my price. So all the reasons that, for example, that people join unions, which are essentially to increase their wages, their benefits, their job stability, those are less pressing, they're less important in a low unemployment rate kind of environment. So that's what we're dealing with here. That can change a union's power or not. A labor supply. If you have a stranglehold on the people who are working in a given industry, for example, or there simply aren't a lot of qualified people in your industry, you need people, and they're all members of a labor union, that can also affect the union's bargaining power. And also sales volume. If GM is selling a lot of cars, for example, and now all of a sudden they're running out of stock, that puts some power back in the union's hands. In terms of the bargaining parties themselves, how much goodwill they actually have to bargain with the other party factors into the power that they carry as well, as does the public perception of that company. And then we get into governmental interventions, and that means basically is a union or is a company acting in bad faith and has the government had to come in and smack their hands. Before we continue, guys, we're a little after 10:30 right now. I would like to stop just to ask a question or comment. I know we're a small group today, not many of us here. But what question or comment would you like to state or ask? Who here has something to say?
What do you feel about snow?
It's probably an unpopular opinion. It put me in a good mood today. Because it kind of felt like the holidays. Like I was driving up here and it was, actually the temperature bottomed out on top of the Buckhorn at about 23 degrees, which I couldn't believe. That's cold for November, even here. But I actually came in like, don't throw something at me. I started humming a Christmas song at some point. It's like, man, it's not even
I
Thanksgiving.
woke up to my mom singing "It's Beginning to Look a Lot Like Christmas."
So it made her happy?
My
Yeah.
house is really I really like Christmas just because we go all out at my house and my family's really into it. So
Outside too?
yeah,
Inflatables?
no inflatables.
Okay. So can I see your house from like 5 miles away?
Yeah,
Okay, that's cool.
but the inside is what we take more time on.
That's awesome. You have a fireplace? Yeah, awesome. Love it. Guys, if you ever drive through my neighborhood at Christmas time, you'll have no trouble finding my house. We don't do a lot of excessive decorating. I may put some lights up, but we don't do the traditional inflatables most people do. I've got an inflatable statue of Darth Vader. And so what we'll do, we put up Darth Vader, and my wife will hang Christmas tinsel around him, and we have like a little light up Christmas ball will hang behind him like it's the Death Star. So we do non-traditional decorations for those people. And we usually leave them up until about the 3rd week of January too. Do you guys do, how long do you like lights?
We're around the same.
My wife leaves them up till after Russian Orthodox Christmas. That's her rule. So, any other comments today, guys? Everybody's feeling it today. Guys, here's the deal. We're going to go through another slide or two, and I'm going to let you out a little early today because I don't want to not include the rest of our colleagues in the conversation today. Guys, some of the other things that also can affect what we refer to as disagreement or agreement costs. The first is, for example, is your union giving you some decent level of strike pay? Do you guys remember, by the way, what the GM workers were getting for strike pay? How much were they making a week? Wasn't much.
Was it under minimum wage?
Yeah, it was like $250 a week they were making for strike pay. If you're taking somebody who's going from making like $1,200 a week to making $250 a week, that's a big cut. And so people are feeling that and not in a good way. The other things too, sometimes, for example, if you're on a strike long enough, you might be eligible for welfare. If you're on a strike, for example, it depends the scenarios in which you can get unemployment compensation if the strike lasts long enough. And if it's a lockout, for example, if you get locked out by a company, if you're not on a strike, you get locked out, you might be more likely to be eligible for unemployment. And then we also have local charities, for example, who are helping you weather the storm. In terms of other things that determine how hard somebody is going to bargain, if you're a union, for example, for a teachers union, and the teachers are putting some leverage on you, even with the idea that they don't have to pay union dues at this point, the teachers, for example, can say, well, you can pay us more because you can always raise taxes. If I work for a government union, you can always raise taxes. If you work for a car company, you can raise the cost of the automobile. If you're an auto worker, for example, though, where is your biggest competition in this continent right now? Where are they likely to offshore automobile production if it becomes too expensive in the United States? Where are a lot of cars made? What country is directly south of the United States? Mexico. Yeah, that's where the Chevy Blazer's made. That's where the Chevy Tahoe is made. So you have global competition on this stuff, meaning the company may eventually say, we're not going to raise your labor rates that high because we can just offshore it, for example. Then we get to company-specific factors. Like, for example, General Motors had a large inventory of vehicles when their auto workers went on strike, so it didn't really hurt them immediately. And if you have product available, they weren't losing a lot of truck sales for people who wanted Chevy trucks to Ford because they had trucks sitting on the lot. Also, in terms of operating costs, if you know what your operating costs are, if they're not highly variable, you can budget for these kinds of strikes. That being said, guys, I think that we covered a good bit today. Brace yourself, though. Monday, we're going to hit it hard and fast and finish this chapter. Guys, I hope you have a wonderful weekend.